Avengers Endgame is literally the biggest film of all time, so I think it's safe to say that nearly everyone has seen the film and that most people at least enjoyed the film, whether or not they think it's well made. And although it is loosely based off of the Infinity Gauntlet comic, it is a mostly original story that pleased fans all across the universe. But what if I told you that Endgame is a complete rip-off of a very small indie film that literally no one has seen? The film in question is The World's End, and was released to limited theatres in 2013, and is incredibly similar to Avengers Endgame story-wise and thematically, even though Endgame came out 6 years later in 2019. Therefore, in this video, I will be breaking down their huge similarities and exposing Disney for how bad of a company they are. The first similarity between this piece of true kino cinema and this theme park is that they both have end in their titles, which is pretty disgusting if you ask me. The World's End is called that because it's the end of a trilogy of films, but Endgame isn't the end to the MCU, so why call it that? The second similarity is the director, Edgar Wright. He directed Ant-Man, which is of course in the MCU, as well as The World's End, therefore— oh wait, fuck, no, they fired him because Disney don't like creativity. The biggest similarity of these films is the structure of the story. In The World's End, the first act is Gary King going around and gathering his old team back together to relive days that have already happened. In Endgame, the first act is Lucas Lee and Batman's side chick bringing their team together again in order to relive days that have already happened as well. In the second act of World's End, they have travelled back to the glory days, but something goes wrong and they encounter some aliens who want to kill them. In the second act of Endgame, they have travelled back to the glory days of when the MCU films were good, but something goes wrong and they encounter some aliens that want to kill them. Fast forward a little bit, and by the third act in The World's End, we've lost two main characters as they have died, Oliver and Pete. In Endgame, by the third act, they have also lost two people, Black Widow and Thor. Then, the third act of The World's End consists of the remaining team fighting a bunch of aliens who are controlled by a villain who believes they are helping humanity for the greater good. And what do you reckon the third act of Avengers Endgame consists of? The remaining team fighting a bunch of aliens whose villainous leader believes he is helping humanity for the greater good. But it doesn't stop there. It is not only similar when it comes to structure, but when it comes to characters' motivations as well as themes. The whole reason why the legend Gary fucking King gathers his team back together is because he is struggling to move on and holding on to the past, which is the main theme of the film. Therefore, he feels like he needs to gather his team to relive days that have already passed. The member of his team who is the hardest to convince is Andy Knightley. This is because Gary not only did something horrible to Andy, but Andy has moved on with his life and now has a wife and kids. Now let me tell you what happens in Endgame. The reason why Human Torch and Joker's Minecraft girlfriend need to gather their team together is because they are struggling to move on and are holding on to the past. Therefore, they feel like they need to gather their team so they can relive days that have already passed. The member of their team that is hardest to convince is Tony Stark. This is because Captain Marvel's uncle not only did something horrible to him, in his eyes at least, but because he now has a wife and kid. However, he then literally builds a time machine all because he misses Peter, so I guess he hasn't moved on. I don't know, Endgame isn't a very consistent film, but World's End is. Also, the characters in general are very similar. There are 6 main characters in The World's End, with one of them being a woman. And how many are there in the original Avengers team? Exactly 6. And there's only one woman. In The World's End, the one woman is the love interest of 2 characters. And in Avengers, the one woman was the love interest of 2 characters. Maybe, I don't know, Steve couldn't take the hint so she moved on to Hulk, I guess? In addition, one of the main messages of The World's End is telling us how bad it is that big corporations swallow smaller businesses by buying them out. And why does that sound so familiar? Before we wrap up, let's see what film executed this storyline with the same themes and characters more smoothly. I will have 4 rounds to decide which film is better. Let's go. The Avengers Endgame steelbook is uglier than what they tried to do with Thor in the film, whereas the World's End steelbook is, I don't have the steelbook, so, I guess Endgame wins by default. The special features of World's End are over 3 hours long and are really good, but Endgame's special features suck and only last 3 times 10 minutes. Not only is Endgame a filthy franchise film, it's loosely adapted from a comic book, but The World's End is a completely original story because writer-director Edgar Wright only makes original stories. He would never adapt a comic or graphic novel. No sir. But I'm sure if he did, it would be one of the greatest films to ever grace cinema. The female characters are far more interesting in Endgame compared to The World's End. Oh, wow, look at that, it's a tie. I guess that's because I can't tell you what film you should like more because people have their own opinions and you can make your mind up yourself. In case you haven't figured out yet, this is a parody video. Yes, Endgame and World's End are very similar, but that's just a coincidence. Both films have their pros and cons and target audiences. I personally believe that World's End is the far better made film, but I enjoy watching Endgame more. Your opinion might be different, I don't know. I just hope it's your opinion and not some dumbasses on the internet because you feel like people will judge you. In a less subtle way of delivering this, be yourself. Jesus Christ.
And suddenly you realize that everything you'd ever told yourself were lies. And believe me, I can sympathize.
That was awful. This video that originally started as a legitimate realization that turned into a Marvel hate piece parody was originally going to be uploaded in like March or something, but then Disney fired Scott Derrickson due to creative differences, and that really fucking pissed me off. So I thought that I should upload it now to make it a bit more relevant.